If you're someone who cries easily, whether it's during a touching scene in a movie, when you hear a beautiful piece of music, or even when you're having a conversation that strikes as something deep within you, you've probably been told at some point in your life that you're too sensitive, that you need to toughen up, or that crying is a sign of weakness. And these messages, whether they came from family, friends, or society at large, have a way of making you feel like there's something fundamentally wrong with the way you're wired, like you're somehow less equipped to handle the world than people who can keep their emotions neatly contained behind a stoic exterior. But what if I told you that this narrative is not only outdated, but scientifically incorrect, that the tears you shed so readily are not a flaw in your design, but rather evidence of a profound psychological advantage that many people spend their entire lives trying to cultivate. And today, we're going to explore exactly what that advantage is, why it exists, and how it shapes the way you experience reality in ways that are both beautiful and deeply human. Because the truth is that crying easily doesn't make you fragile. It makes you connected. And in a world that often rewards emotional detachment, that connection is a rare and precious form of strength that deserves to be understood and celebrated. Let's start by acknowledging something fundamental about human emotion that often gets overlooked in our achievement-obsessed culture. Emotions are not distractions from rational thought. They are a form of intelligence. And this isn't just poetic language, it's neuroscience. Because your brain processes emotional information through complex neural networks that involve the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex, working together to help you navigate social situations, assess threats, build relationships, and make decisions that align with your deepest values. And when you cry easily, what's actually happening is that your emotional processing system is highly attuned, meaning you're picking up on subtleties in your environment that others might miss entirely. A shift in someone's tone of voice, the unspoken sadness behind a smile, the weight of a moment that carries more meaning than the words being spoken. And this heightened sensitivity isn't a bug in your system, it's a feature. One that allows you to read between the lines of human interaction with remarkable accuracy. Now, you might be wondering why some people cry more easily than others, and the answer is beautifully complex, involving a combination of biological factors, childhood experiences, and personality traits that together create what psychologists call emotional expressiveness. And research has shown that people who cry easily often score higher on measures of empathy, particularly affective empathy, which is the capacity to not just understand someone else's feelings intellectually, but to actually feel them in your own body. And this isn't just about being nice or caring. It's about having a nervous system that's wired for deep connection, one that doesn't maintain rigid boundaries between self and other, but instead allows emotional experiences to flow between people, creating bridges of understanding that form the foundation of genuine intimacy. And yes, this can be overwhelming at times, especially in a world that constantly bombards you with stimuli, but it also means you have access to a dimension of human experience that many people are cut off from. A richness of feeling that makes life more vivid, more meaningful, and ultimately more worth living. There's a concept in psychology called emotional granularity, which refers to the ability to identify and distinguish between different emotional states with precision. And interestingly, people who cry easily often demonstrate higher emotional granularity because they're not suppressing or avoiding their feelings, but actually experiencing them fully, allowing each emotion to rise, peak, and naturally subside. And this practice, whether conscious or unconscious, develops your capacity to navigate the full spectrum of human emotion with sophistication. So, while someone else might feel vaguely bad and call it stress, you can identify that you're feeling disappointed about a specific situation, anxious about a particular outcome, and perhaps a little grief about what could have been. And this precision matters enormously because you can't effectively address an emotional need. you can't name, which means that your tendency to feel deeply and cry easily is actually training you in a form of emotional literacy that serves as a foundation for psychological resilience and self-awareness. Let's talk about vulnerability for a moment, because in a culture that often equates strength with invulnerability, crying is seen as exposing yourself, as letting people see that you can be affected, that you're not in complete control. And yes, that's exactly what it is. But here's what researchers like Brené Brown have discovered through decades of studying human connection. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. It's where authentic connection happens. Because when you allow yourself to cry in front of someone, you're essentially saying, I trust you enough to see me in my unguarded state, and that invitation often gives the other person permission to lower their own defenses, creating a space where real communication can occur, the kind that goes beyond surface level pleasantries and touches on the things that actually matter: your fears, your hopes, your disappointments, your dreams. And this is why people who cry easily often build deeper relationships than those who pride themselves on never showing emotion. Because depth requires honesty, and honesty requires the courage to be seen as you truly are, tears and all. There's also a fascinating physiological component to crying that gives you a measurable advantage in terms of stress management and emotional regulation. Because tears aren't just water, they contain stress hormones like cortisol and adrenocorticotropic hormone, which means that when you cry, you're literally releasing stress from your body in a tangible physical way. And studies have shown that emotional tears, as opposed to tears from cutting onions or getting dust in your eye, contain higher levels of protein-based hormones, suggesting that crying serves a biological purpose in helping you process and recover from emotional experiences. And beyond the chemical release, crying also activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the rest and digest response that counteracts the fight or flight activation of stress. So when you have a good cry, you're essentially hitting a reset button on your nervous system, allowing your body to return to a state of equilibrium. And people who cry easily have regular access to this natural regulation mechanism. Whereas people who suppress their tears often carry unprocessed emotional tension in their bodies, which can manifest as chronic stress, muscle tension, sleep problems, and a host of other health issues over time. Now, I want to address something that you've probably experienced if you're someone who cries easily, which is the feeling that you need to apologize for your tears, that you're inconveniencing others or making them uncomfortable with your emotional expression. And while it's true that not everyone knows how to hold space for someone else's emotions, your tears are never something you need to apologize for, because crying is one of the most fundamentally human things you can do. It's a form of communication that predates language, a signal that something matters to you, that you're connected to your experience rather than dissociated from it. And when you apologize for crying, you're essentially apologizing for being human, for having a heart that responds to beauty and pain and loss and joy. And that apology, while it might make others more comfortable, comes at the cost of your own self-acceptance. So instead of saying, I'm sorry for crying, you might try, I need a moment, or these tears are just part of how I process. And in doing so, you reclaim your emotional expression as valid and worthy of space, rather than as something shameful that needs to be hidden or explained away. Let's consider the creative advantages that come with being someone who feels deeply and cries easily, because there's a well-documented connection between emotional sensitivity and creative expression, with many artists, writers, musicians, and innovators describing their work as emerging from their capacity to feel intensely and to access emotional states that others might avoid or suppress. And this makes sense when you think about what creativity actually requires, which is the ability to see beyond the surface of things, to notice connections that aren't immediately obvious, to sit with uncertainty and complexity rather than rushing to premature conclusions. And all of these capacities are strengthened by emotional depth. Because when you allow yourself to feel fully, you're developing a tolerance for intensity that translates into other areas of your life, giving you the courage to explore ideas that might seem risky, to express perspectives that might be unpopular, to create work that's authentic rather than merely acceptable. And history is full of highly sensitive individuals whose tears and emotional depth were inseparable from their genius. People who felt the world so acutely that they had no choice but to transform that feeling into something that could be shared, something that could help others feel less alone in their own emotional experiences. There's also something to be said about the moral and ethical advantages of being emotionally responsive, because empathy, the kind that moves you to tears when you witness suffering or injustice, is the psychological foundation of compassion and moral action. And while intellectual understanding of right and wrong is important, it's the emotional response, the felt sense that something matters, that typically motivates people to actually do something about the problems they perceive. And this is why social movements throughout history have relied not just on logical arguments, but on storytelling and imagery that evokes emotional responses, because people who feel deeply are people who care deeply, and people who care deeply are the ones who work to create change, who volunteer their time, who stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, who refuse to accept suffering as inevitable. And your tears, far from being a sign of weakness, are evidence of a moral sensitivity that the world desperately needs. A refusal to become numb or callous in the face of pain, whether your own or someone else's. Now, let's acknowledge the challenges, because being someone who cries easily isn't always comfortable, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. You've probably experienced moments where you wished you could just turn off your feelings for a while, where the intensity of your emotional responses felt like too much to carry, where you envied people who seemed to glide through difficult situations without getting emotionally involved. And those feelings are completely valid, because high sensitivity does come with challenges, particularly in environments that are chaotic, overstimulating, or emotionally invalidating. But here's what's important to understand. The goal isn't to become less sensitive. It's to develop the skills and self-awareness to navigate your sensitivity effectively. And that might mean setting better boundaries, creating more time for solitude and restoration, seeking out relationships and environments that honor your emotional depth rather than penalizing it, and learning to distinguish between emotions that are giving you valuable information and emotions that are simply overwhelming your system without serving a useful purpose. Because emotional intelligence isn't about feeling everything all the time. It's about knowing how to work with your feelings in ways that support your well-being and your goals. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want you to consider the possibility that your tears are not a problem to be solved, but a strength to be cultivated. That in a world that often feels disconnected, superficial, and numb, your capacity to feel deeply and cry easily is a form of courage, a refusal to armor yourself against life's full spectrum of experiences. And yes, that openness will sometimes lead to pain, to disappointment, to grief, but it will also lead to profound joy, to moments of connection that take your breath away, to a sense of being fully alive that is worth every tear you've ever cried. And the people in your life who truly matter, the ones who are capable of real intimacy, will not see your tears as weakness, but as evidence of your humanity, your authenticity, your willingness to be present to what is, rather than pretending to be what you think you should be. So the next time you feel tears rising, instead of fighting them or apologizing for them, try simply allowing them, noticing what they're telling you, what they're releasing, what they're honoring. Because those tears are a psychological advantage that connects you more deeply to yourself, to others, and to the profound mystery of being human in a complex and beautiful world.